My name is Kevin O'Sullivan. I'm Environment and Science Editor with the Irish Times. And as you'll see from the title, the word energy and climate change don't feature, but they're two issues that force themselves onto the agenda on a regular basis. And I have to say, climate change is often a source of pessimism, but energy is cause for optimism, I think. And when you see what's coming down the track over the next decade in terms of technology, I think that optimism is well founded. Just to say that we've experienced quite a week, as you all know, apart from the resignation of the Minister for Communications, Climate Action and Environment, which I think is, I have to say, from a non-political perspective, is not helpful given what the agenda is in terms of climate change and energy, but that's my own personal view. And then we had the groundbreaking UN report from the IPCC on 1.5 degrees and what that means for the world. And to put it mildly, it came up with some very stark findings. Then we had the budget, and it saw no increase in carbon tax despite intense speculation that there would be, and there wasn't even a miserly £5 per tonne of carbon applied. And you know, many people have been asking, what does that mean in terms of clarity and consistency on climate policy? So that might come up in our discussions. Some of you mightn't have had a chance to see the EirGrid case outcome in Holland, which is really interesting because it's putting it up to governments that they have to be meaningful in their renewable targets and their climate emission reductions. And I'd say a lot of governments around the world are looking at that, and they're not comfortable with what the court decision has been, but we'll watch that space. And another interesting report out today from PwC, who've been monitoring implementation of the Paris Agreement, and that shows we're slipping further out of reach in terms of most countries throughout the world. But there is good news, and that is that the wind is blowing, so I'm sure you're all glad to hear that, even though I hope it doesn't blow too much over the next 24 hours. So a lot to talk about, and hopefully we can have a quick overview on the 2030 targets. The speakers are going to give a short introductory address of a few minutes. They're not going to go through their dazzling CVs, but give their perspective on the agenda today, and they might even reveal what keeps them awake at night in terms of issues, and give an overview of the future, particularly over the next decade. So I'd like to introduce that panel now. On my right is Martin Finucane, Principal Officer, who's leading the Strategic Energy Division in the Department of Communications, Climate Action and Environment. And beside him is Seán Kelly, the distinguished Fine Gael MEP, who had a critical role in the achieving agreement on the 32% target for 2030. And I'm sure you all know the famous picture that was taken in the early morning, which really gave people a great lift in terms of, you know, good collective action for the betterment of the world. And next to Seán is John Fitzgerald, who's Director of Grid Development and Interconnection with EirGrid. And finally, then we have Anne-Marie McCague, who's IWEA's Head of Policy. So over to you. And firstly, I would like to ask Martin to address you briefly.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'd just like to outline maybe what we're doing in relation to, you might have heard the words National Energy Climate Plan. Basically, it's part of the Clean Energy Package, which is a big piece of legislative proposals put forward by the Commission over the last 4 years now, I think. It involves, in its current format, 8 legislative proposals, so it's way broader than just setting renewable energy targets or energy efficiency targets, although they are a very key component of it. But I think if you look at the composition of the package as a whole, you are going to see some very fundamental changes to the energy market at retail level as well as at generation level over the next decade, as the various aspects facilitated and brought into play by that package comes into place. One key part of that, which I'll focus on today very briefly, is the National Energy and Climate Plan. Basically, this is a consolidated plan that member states have to put in place to show their energy and climate plans basically from 2020 to 2030, but also to take a more forward-term view out as far as 2040. It's a very clever design by the Commission and the member states. Previously, in the previous 2020 targets, a lot of separate plans were put in place and developed almost in a silo mentality. So on the climate side, the MMR was the big return and plan put together by each member state. Each member state had to develop an NREAP, the National Renewable Energy Action Plan, and also each member state developed the NEAP, the National Energy Efficiency Action Plan. And they're the three main ones, but there's a whole layer of other plans that are done. This time the Commission said they were done at different times, different years, different inputs, different modelling used to support them. So it was very hard for the Commission or a member state or an outsider to actually get a single overview of what was happening in a member state or how the planning was going in a member state. The single plan that's now been produced will bring all of these into a single document, so that for the first time you can see the energy efficiency plans layered upon the renewable energy plans and the climate action plans. So basically it'll be a much more consolidated and concise piece of work. It will be looking at it's not just setting a target out to 2030. In energy terms, it'll be looking at a virtual decarbonisation of energy by 2040. So it's really setting the clear long-term vision here. It's only going one direction. It's also much broader than just about setting the targets. A big part of it is going to be looking at about the introduction of decentralised energy, more empowerment of consumer, and all of that will have a fundamental way on the way the energy market operates and sets up over the next number of years. In Ireland, we're already beginning to look at national level out to 2040. The government recently launched earlier this year the Project 2040, which was basically a cross-departmental and cross-societal look at planning. Two of the main things that jumped out of that process were the level of demographic growth, unusually in European terms where populations are stable or in decline. The Irish population is forecast to grow between now and 2040 by 1 million people. That's basically a 20% increase in population over that relatively short space of time. It also forecasts kind of in terms of looking outwards, a relatively stable economic growth period, and at a time that will lead then into a combination of the two of those into increased energy demand. Even allowing for a more energy efficient society, you are likely to see energy demand go upwards as a result of all of those. In terms of putting together the structure for 2030, what we've started to do to date is look with the ESRI and the CSO in doing the energy growth. So we get the economic growth figures from them, we get the demographic figures from them. SCAI then take those figures and turn them into the energy modelling figures. And then in turn, once we produce the energy forecast from SCAI, the EPA, the Environment Protection Agency, take the energy figures and translate those into climate. So there's a whole link here that's put together to create the national forecasts. One of the things in looking out to 2030 that you're going to see, and some of the speakers alluded to it here today, is you're going to see a development of a diversity of technologies. So far up to 2020, renewable energy in particular has been driven on the electricity side by the development of onshore wind. What we're going to see in the move to 2030 and 2040 is a much broader diversity of technologies being developed and deployed in an Irish and European context. There'll be an increasing emphasis on offshore as the efficiencies and price differentials change over time. You're going to see solar introduced at scale into the Irish system. You're going to see increased use of bioenergy in different guises, renewable gas, etc. That combined with greater interconnection, and I know Peter is here from Greenlink, but we're also looking at Celtic Interconnector, which is a project to connect Ireland and France. And you're also looking at kind of a much greater level of energy efficiency being built into the economy, particularly into things like much stronger planning regulations going forward. Anyone familiar with those will have seen the NZEB consultations, the near zero buildings regulations. So all of those combined are going to show that there's quite significant changes coming down the direction, much more so than just a higher target. The energy forecasts that we'll be using for the NECP aren't published yet, but they will be published by the end of October. They will take on board not just the demographic and economic growth that we've shown, but also take into account all of the energy and some of the climate actions that were identified in the National Development Plan. So this is the first time we'll be applying the effect of those actions into our modelling going forward. So it'll be interesting when they come out at the end of October. Okay.
Thank you very much, Martin, for that. Sorry, Peter was hiding down there. I should have introduced you. You all know Peter, so he doesn't really need an introduction. So we'll be coming to Peter soon. I'd like to just call on Seán now to give you a quick overview.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here. Since I came into the room, we lost a minister. So it'll be interesting how things will pan out there. But that won't affect what is decided at European level, and especially in relation to the whole clean energy package. In the first mandate, I'm now in the European Parliament 9 years. I kind of majored in the data, also in the whole area of research, Horizon 2020. I did the GDPR for our group. But this time I decided to try and move into the energy side of things. So I represented the Parliament at the COP21 in Paris. That was a great outcome. And arising out of that then, the European institutions, especially the Commission, said that we had to make sure that we have the legislation in place to live up to our commitments in relation to Paris, the COP21 agreement. And they came forward with packages. And one that struck me was when President Juncker was speaking in the State of the Union address immediately after Paris. He said he wanted Europe to be the world leader in renewable energy. So I said, that's good. So when it came to the various packages, there were 5 or 6 in the package. There was the renewable energy, energy performance of buildings, energy efficiency, market design, and governance. So you bid at group level for rapporteurship. So I bid for 2, the energy performance of buildings, which I felt there was huge scope here in Ireland in particular to do a lot on, and renewable energy. And the coordinator gave me the renewable energy one because the guy, Ben Benson, who got the energy performance of buildings, is from Denmark, and he actually built a house himself, which is 100% passive. So on that basis, he got it, and probably rightly so. So once I got the job, I remember one MEP from Germany said, I hope you said you don't turn out like the previous Irish person who got a job in the clean energy package. He said, she wrote her own report and ignored the rest of us. So that was a kind of a warning shot across my bow that I couldn't go off and do what I liked. And obviously you can't do that because you have to do everything in Parliament on majority. There is no government, so you have to build majorities. First of all, with your own group for what you want, and then you negotiate with the other groups to get a compromise. And my biggest obstacle was actually in my own group, because the EPP, European People's Party, is the biggest, 220 MEPs, but also there would be very pro-industry, they'd be cautious about competitiveness, and some of them would be, let's say, doubtful about the climate change agenda. And especially we had our 2 biggest groups by far are from Poland and from Germany, and they wanted very little in terms of being ambitious outside of what the Commission had proposed. So the Commission proposed 27% target for renewable energy. They wanted to go no higher than that. And I wanted more. I felt it wasn't sufficiently ambitious. And when I met the shadows from the other groups, I could see that the Greens obviously wanted 40 or 50, but they had big backing from the S&D, and one of those was the rapporteur, Blanco Lopez from Spain. They had backing from GUE, they had backing from most groups. So I had to go back to our own group really and get support there, because there was no point in proposing something unless you could get your own group to do it. I was lucky in one sense because the coordinator sits alongside me in Parliament, Christianis Karins. He's from Latvia, so I was able to discuss things with him and he'd be practical. And the chairman is a former Polish Prime Minister and President of Parliament, Jerzy Buzek, and we were good friends. And he really was crucial because he put kind of his nationalist views aside in the overall good of getting a deal which Europe could live with. So, eventually we agreed in Parliament, you probably know, on a 35% target. And I sold that to the EPP on the basis that wouldn't be the final figure. In fact, I told the Germans and the Poles that more than likely it would be closer to 27 than 35, probably maybe 29 or 30. So they swallowed it, but that wasn't really the intention. The other point which was crucial for them and crucial for all member states, it isn't as bad as it sounds. For 2020 you had binding targets at national level. They didn't want binding targets anymore at national level. They wanted an overall European target. And I'll come to that later on, how that's going to be achieved in terms of governance. And I had huge resistance from the other groups in relation to that. And I kind of bargained agreeing to a higher target. I said I can sell a higher target, EPP level, if we don't have binding targets at national level. And that was kind of what we agreed. And then we got it through Parliament with a very clear majority. And that was important, because if you don't get a good majority in Parliament, your hand is weakened very much when it comes to trilogues. But we did get a big majority in Parliament, which strengthens our hand going into trilogues. And even though the Council and the Commission wanted 27%, we eventually agreed on 32%. And we did it in a night in June, and actually around midnight, Jerzy Buzek, who was chairing it, former Polish Prime Minister, he's chairman of our committee now, the ITRE committee, he said we have to finish now in 10 minutes because our interpreters have to go. And I said to myself, if we don't finish this tonight, the council are going to go back. The council are going to dictate to the negotiator, who was the minister from Bulgaria, who happened to be an EPP, so I was able to twist his arm a bit. And I said, we'll finish up with 30 or 31 the very most. So I said, excuse me, Mr. Chairman, I think we should continue. I think most people, I said here, know English. And the others agreed with me. So we went on until 4 in the morning, and we got an agreement, which we were very dubious that the council would accept. And actually, over the weekend, the council rejected it. But we put pressure on them, so people didn't really know that. They went back again. We made a slight alteration to the text on something, and the council accepted it. So now we have the 32% target, which is binding for all of Europe. And the national plans in relation to climate and energy will have to meet that target for two reasons. Number one, because it's legislation, and number two, because Europe cannot say it's going to be a leader worldwide, especially with the US pulling out if it doesn't meet its own targets. So I think I might just leave it at that for the moment.
Perfect. Thank you for that. John Fitzgerald.
Okay. Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here as well. I think the targets that have been agreed by Seán, I'd like to commend him. I think it's a great job, and I think we need to be ambitious. We'll see later on a little bit of a storm coming in. Hopefully we'll be out of here before then. But I think back, I've been in the energy business 25 odd years more. And when we started off, I can remember people hearing about this wind energy business, and they likened it to counterfeit money. They said you could get away with passing it in small quantities. And look how far we've come. And I think the reason why we're able to talk about 2030 with confidence and ambition is because of how we've done towards 2020 as an industry. And everybody in this room has played their part in that. And it's been a long journey, but we're going to hit our targets in electricity in terms of 40% renewables, which is great. And I think it was an ambitious target, but we got there. And I think ambitious targets are required because we've a lot to do to leave the the world at least not too. I don't think we leave it as good as we got it, but hopefully not too bad, and we can minimise the damage we're inflicting on the planet. I think about EirGrid and what we've done, the journey we've come through, and there's probably 3 big things. And I think the first was how to run a system without all the thermal generation on it that we're accustomed to, and that has taken us out of our comfort zone. And we've done a lot of work with DS3 and with the industry to put in place new products and services and change settings, so we can now operate the system with 65% instantaneous wind, which is greater than anyone else is doing in the world at the moment. So I think that's a real thing. Then we had to try and connect all that, and we've done a lot of work with ESB networks in connecting all these wind farms and solar farms and predominantly onshore wind to the network, and that's taken a massive effort, and there's been a lot of innovation in the industry to do that. I suppose lastly, we've had to change our own strategy, because Grid 25 was a very grand strategy to build overhead infrastructure to accommodate remote energy sources, and that was roundly rejected by stakeholders, voters, politicians. So we've had to cut our cloth to suit our measure, and we've amended our strategy in 3 ways, and I think they're helping us and they'll help the industry. And the first is, firstly, early engagement and greater levels of consultation, and the wind industry has had to do that as well. Secondly, an openness to all kinds of technology to connect and put in place reinforcements. And finally, leveraging the existing network with new ways of working and thinking, and we've seen that with major projects replaced with less invasive ones. So I think back to that, we're now in a situation where we're world leaders in energy, and if Europe wants to be world leaders in energy, we're going to have to think harder. I think we've done the easy bit. Beyond 2020 to 2030, what does it mean? Well, we're doubling the target, and in electricity, the ask is going to be greater. We've moved out of our comfort zone. We're now at 65%. Our plan is to be at 75% by 2020. Beyond 2020, how far can we go? Well, we need to work with the industry. We will need inertia from other sources. We'll have to think innovatively outside the box about how to do that. I think the industry are up for it, and we will work to keep the lights on in a responsible manner with the industry, and to try and achieve the most we can with the system and with the industry. And that might mean doing things with gas and with other industries, but we're committed to being leaders and facilitators in decarbonising not just the electricity system but the energy system, because I think electricity is going to play a bigger part for society in the whole, in terms of electric vehicles, heat pumps, and I think it's a great challenge, and it's a very exciting time to be in this industry, and that's all I have to say. I think I'll pass on to Peter at that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Seán. So yeah, I'm going to wear sort of more the technology and Greenlink hat rather than IWEA hat, so I'll let Anne-Marie talk about the big policy picture. But I just wanted to set out maybe 5 building blocks that are now available to us that allow us to be, shoot for a target that we just couldn't have dreamt of 5 years ago. So back in 2012, 2013, none of these factors existed, and I think these really do enable us to shoot for very big numbers, such as the 70% that we've set out. The first one is I think is the big one, is the falling costs. We've seen spectacular falls in the cost of both offshore and solar projects, but some of the same factors affect onshore projects. The cost of capital has fallen for all projects, and we're at an all-time low cost of capital, and that really helps the cost of wind. Technology, you saw some new machines from Finucane this morning, and that trend is across all suppliers. So really, the cost of onshore wind had fallen gradually and sort of plateaued around 2011, 12, 13, and then it just dropped again, and I think it's probably pretty much halved since 2012, and that opens up all sorts of possibilities, because we're no longer talking about targets as being a burden and a cost. These are, European targets are very welcome, but the question is, do we need them? Why would we need them? In fact, I mean, if it's cheaper to go to 70%, and that's what our study says, well, maybe we should take the targets as a base, and then work above that and go as far as it makes sense economically to do so. So I think the falling costs are a complete revolution. answering Kevin's question, are there any concerns in that area? There are a myriad of policy points where we may not be able to achieve those falling costs. The bill set out earlier. If we mess up on the noise guidelines, if we don't get a chance to build taller turbines, longer blades, we can knock big chunks of potential savings off the pitch completely, 5, 10, 15% blocks. And we need each of those if we're going to get right down to the point where wind can and should be cheaper than all other forms of generation. And that's not something I could have possibly stood up and said here 5 years ago. The other big sort of change, I think, big technology that will enable this capability, the reason we can shoot for things like 70% is interconnection. And John is very familiar, having built EWIC, with what's involved in building one of these pieces of infrastructure. They take a lot of coordination, both sides of the water. A lot of regulatory integration and coordination required, but when they're built, they certainly deliver in spades, and EWIC has done that over the years. It was the right amount and size at the time. Demand is growing, as was mentioned there, and obviously with the amount of flexible wind on both sides of the Irish Sea, it's time to do the next one, and it's time to do the one to France as well. All of our modelling shows that 1 is good, 2 is even better, and that's how you're going to get to 2030. Interconnection is by far the cheapest and most proven technology for balancing intermittent variable sources of energy, such as onshore wind, offshore wind, and solar. But you need interconnection regardless. The other revolution that has happened in the last 4 or 5 years that wasn't particularly anticipated is the cost of batteries has collapsed, and that's driven, of course, by I think the EV industry and indeed the mobile phone industry, and so the prices there have come down to the point where it's now I think some of the pump storage in the UK was charging 25, 26 pounds a megawatt hour for their balancing services. We built a battery in Newcastle last year, and we at 12 pounds a megawatt hour. We halved the cost of providing that, and Ireland spends, somewhere north of 100 million a year on these sort of services. Batteries is now going to take a big chunk out of those costs, both in cost of just redispatching the system efficiently from a fuel point of view and paying for ancillary services. When you put it all together, batteries don't use any fuel to do that, and that makes them the perfect complement to enable the really big blocks of wind we're talking about here. The last two I won't go into too much detail about, but again, they are the building blocks that makes it all to come together. So heat pumps. All I'd say there is, look, that is a perfectly proven technology way when it comes to converting our heat, even our oil boilers scattered around the country, very ripe for conversion there. We need to build in some storage into those heat pumps to make sure they work well with wind, but really that's their prime technology. And I think the electric vehicles, I don't need to say an awful lot about it. I've been driving one for 10 years. It's definitely going to happen soon. It's now. I mean, if you see there's 180 models in development. The only reason that the big guys aren't pushing this at the moment is they just can't build them fast enough. If all the main brands started promoting these, they couldn't. They wouldn't be able to sell them. They're a very compelling case. Once they have the capability, Mercedes-Benz announced last week they're putting 25 billion into it. Once that investment is completed, we're going to see a massive conversion, and that is just so good for wind because you're immediately enabling a massively flexible source of demand. Put all that together, and we can. There's no reason at all why we shouldn't be shooting at 70% for 2030.
Thank you very much for that. And Anne-Marie?
Thank you. It's great to hear so much optimism around the renewable electricity sector on the panel today. As you know, IWEA believes that we can achieve 70% renewable electricity by 2030, and that it's not only technically feasible, but is cost neutral to the consumer. And energy is central to the way we live. And as energy consumers, we want a system that's secure, we want competitively priced energy, and of course we want sustainable energy. And that can all be delivered through indigenous renewable energy resources such as wind. And in IWEA, we believe that we should look at this more as an energy system target rather than just a renewable electricity target. So the energy system is made up of heat, transport, and electricity. And renewable electricity can contribute to the targets for heat and transport, and that's what our 70 by 30 report shows. we can contribute to their targets through the installation of heat pumps and through the deployment of more electric vehicles. But to achieve this, we need more grid, basically. And that's not acknowledging the work that's already been done by EirGrid on the grid, but we need 90% SNSP by 2030, and we need to reduce the minimum level of conventional energy down to 700 megawatts by 2030. And both of these things are achievable within that timeline. We need more interconnection. The electrification of the Celtic Interconnector and of Greenlink is essential to meeting our renewable electricity targets. We need more storage and batteries, as Peter said. So our analysis has shown that we need 1,700 megawatts of batteries to meet 70% by 2030. And of course, we're delighted to see more data centres coming on the system. They'll help flatten that demand and be there during the night when the wind blows. But most importantly, we need commitment. We need commitment from our political leaders and from policymakers. We need timely implementation of practical, pragmatic policy. We've had some great wins this year with RES and with ECP, but we're still talking about refit, and we're still talking about issues with grid connection. And policymakers need to acknowledge that. They need to learn from those issues and make sure that those issues aren't repeated through RES and through ECP. We have one of the best natural resources in Europe, and we have one of the best grids for integrating that resource. And we boast about that, and we should boast about that. The DS3 project is fantastic, and there's been great work done by EirGrid. But we can't keep making these messages and then walking over to Brussels and asking for an easier ride than everybody else. 70% by 2030 does sound ambitious, but it's totally feasible, and we believe that anything less than that is unacceptable.
Very good. Thank you very much for all that. And I think there's to maintain the positive air. There's a lot of talk about ambition and optimism and transformation of the energy system, which is good to hear. Two small housekeeping things. We plan to finish at 5 o'clock, and Brett of IWEA will give a short closing address. And Slido is operational again. I'm glad to see the questions are already coming through. So thank you for that. So just to ask a few questions in relation to all of what you've said. Seán, could I ask you, how, in terms of the 2030 target, is the demand going to manifest itself on national governments? Like you hinted at it there, but what sort of mechanism will guarantee that type of a figure? And you accepted yourself, it's a very demanding figure.
Absolutely. Firstly, I think Anne-Marie is right. We have to change our attitude in Ireland. Going over to Brussels with the poor mouth, that day is gone. Europe has a target. Every member state will have to reach its own targets. They have to have a national energy and climate plan drawn up by the end of this year, and the Commission will assess what that plan is based on the 2020 target, standard rate contribution, GDP per capita, potential for deployment, and level of interconnection. So, to be absolutely stupid of the Irish government doing figures on that basis to propose anything less. Secondly, while there are no binding national targets, the Commission has a fair bit of clout, because they will assess these and they will say whether they will collectively meet the overall and whether each member state is playing its part based on this criteria. And also, the 2020 was kind of left run until 2020 to see how you get on. They will be assessed in 2022, 2025, 2027. Member states will be told, if you're not coming up to speed, doing enough work in this area, you'll have to do it, otherwise they will have to pay or buy something from other countries, etc., to compensate. So I think my message is, and I think Anne-Marie is right, the fooling is over. John and Peter have pointed out, we can do it actually effectively, but we need political leadership to say, yes, we're going to do it, and we should actually, if I may finish on this, Leo Varadkar spoke in the European Parliament in January. The one critical area was our lack of meeting our targets in 2020. He admitted it. He said that we were laggards, but he said it isn't good enough, we would change. So we should be going from laggards to leaders.
Related to that, what is the perception of Ireland in Europe in terms of that poor performance?
It's tolerated on the basis that there would be a certain sympathy up until now for the fact that we're bigger than most in terms of agriculture and the financial crisis. But from now on, if we don't seem to be doing what we can do, we're going to be making fools of ourselves. Because you can't go on the one hand going around boasting about how we get over the economic crisis with the fastest growing economy in Europe, but, oh, we can't meet our targets. So I think they're tolerated up until now, but not from now on.
Okay. Martin, could I ask you, related to that, will the combination of the National Development Plan, and we know how much is assigned to climate action in that, and the NECP, will that sort of bring us back to the right position where we need to be in terms of moving towards being a leader on climate change and being very specific about how we will do that?
I think what it'll do is certainly for the first part of it, set a vision and a goal in terms of how we see we're going to get there. Secondly, it will set out the policies and measures, showing particularly on the energy side, I suppose, where we have more of the levers in our own control, how we're actually going to achieve a lot of these. The work we're doing in terms of preparing for the the NECP currently is taking on board a lot of the measures that the government, in fairness, I think have already developed and put in play as part of the Project 2040. They took an innovative approach this time by publishing a 10-year capital plan, the National Development Plan. And the National Development Plan contains about 22.5 billion euros worth of investment over that period, about a third of it roughly from the state and about 2/3 from the commercials. But in reality, there's an awful lot of actions in that already that will be built upon, and one of the things we're modelling in terms of looking at that, the NECP, is the effect of all of these combined measures to show the distance that they will bring us towards delivering on these targets.
Related to that, it's a very tight time frame. You have a key role in that. I'd say you probably have the toughest job over the next 3 months of anyone in the sector. But is that all doable? I know you have another year to finalise it, but it seems a remarkably tight time frame to commit to an energy profile, a climate profile for the next 20 years.
I think one of the things to remember is that this isn't starting from a blank sheet of paper. There's a lot of work already done on this. There's a lot of frameworks already in place. A lot of those frameworks were set a small number of years ago and obviously would need to be built upon and developed. But there is a very considerable body of work already there in place.
Okay. John, could I ask you, given the level of ambition that's there, there's going to be huge demand on infrastructure and on EirGrid in particular. Is it possible that will be delivered in a timely fashion, given all the infrastructural delays and problems and policy difficulties that sometimes arise? I'm just very conscious of the IPCC report saying that so much has to happen by 2030.
So yeah, it's a massive challenge, and with the increase in someone talked about, I think it was Anne-Marie talked about the data centres. Like, even if the 2020 target, if there were no new targets, the amount of renewables we need just to stay still with growing demand and a buoyant economy is significant. So we need, just to stay at the 40%, we need more renewables. So it is a significant challenge to get more. I think out into the future, we see a lot of interest in the offshore piece, particularly domestically off the east coast of Ireland, and I think that's part of it. Solar, a lot of applications that EirGrid have processed in that space. and there's always onshore wind and batteries and renewables. So there's interconnection coming as well. So there are a lot of, I don't think there's one particular technology or answer or panacea. I think we will have our challenges in infrastructure. We certainly will, and that is a significant. We've seen it with the North-South interconnector, where it's been a very difficult project for EirGrid and for the energy industry. It goes way back. It will help us integrate renewables north and south, and I think that is an example of how infrastructure can be very, very, very difficult. I think we have to learn the lessons and try and do it cleverly to minimise the amount of new greenfield infrastructure that is required, and to do it in a sensitive way, to be consultative. We have a lot of infrastructure in parts of the country where there's been no issues and it's below the radar. You hear about the projects that get into trouble, but we have managed to connect a lot of wind, contestably built by yourselves and by others, and put in reinforcements in a way that has caused minimal issues. You just hear about the problematic ones. So we have achieved a lot in this space. I think we have to be clever, we have to consult early, and we have to be ambitious. But it's by no means a foregone conclusion that we're going to be successful. It's going to take a lot of effort, collective effort and leadership from across all the stakeholders.
Fair enough, thank you for that. Peter, can I ask you, as a person who's probably uniquely placed at the coalface, using a variety of technologies, clearly there are issues around delivery in terms of timing. As an outsider looking in, it seems to me that offshore will probably take at least 5 years before it really gathers any momentum. Solar remains it's unclear as to when that sort of significant growth will happen. We know it's going to happen. But what are the key blockages on those fronts as you see them?
I think actually the different stages of developing a project, develop, construction, operation, the development stage, you won't find a lot of sympathy for people out there with developers with a capital D. But right now, the development process of starting from scratch, finding a greenfield site, and then taking let's say a 50-50 chance on securing enough land. Then you've got a probability of getting planning. That is a long, expensive process. And previously that would more or less get you there. You'd probably get connected eventually. Now, for the next decade, you're going to have to add two more risks. One is, can you survive a judicial review? And can you then also win in an auction? And altogether, when you multiply all those probabilities together, the development process, whether you're solar, onshore or offshore, is fraught with risk. And if you spend $1 million doing that, and you on a portfolio of 4 or 5 projects, if you've less than a 50-50 chance of success, you need to be recovering a lot of money each time to break even, and you need to recover a lot more to justify investment in it. So at the moment, the industry has the luxury of a backlog of development that was chasing, let's at the very end potentially attractive refit rates. Once that pipeline of projects has been converted, I think we need to look very closely at what the investment case looks like for an international investor coming into Ireland to say, am I prepared to risk 10, 15, 20 million of development money at those sort of rates, at that sort of risk level? And so I think it's what's the word? Unacceptable if we find that half the cost of energy is the paperwork and permitting a project. I think we can all get our heads around paying for steel and copper and building these sort of things. But if we end up having to pay, now that the costs have come down so much, the fraction of that development effort and permitting costs with the risk of failure is probably the biggest risk I see. To create that pipeline of projects that's needed. And of course, we need a pipeline of projects that's over and above the level that are being contracted through auctions. You want an oversupply. Right. So that's an interesting prospect as well. You spend tens of millions creating an oversupply, knowing half of them won't be needed. That's an interesting dynamic.
Okay. Anne-Marie, could I ask you just how you sort of calibrate 70 by 30 within that scenario? There must be a lot of uncertainties, even though you've clearly set as an organisation a very strong target that is very clear and very ambitious. But given all those unknowns that are still there, policy difficulties, the delays in guidelines on wind and solar, how do you think that 70 by 30 target is genuinely realisable?
Yeah, so our analysis has shown that it is definitely technically feasible. So I guess then the unknowns are the policy aspects and probably the economic aspects, and trying to close the gaps on them. So we've talked a bit about the cost of wind and about reducing down that cost, but also giving the wind industry a bit more certainty. So through subsidies such as RES, allowing that financial certainty so that wind developers are able to go out and get funding for these projects. Another good way of doing that would be through our corporate PPAs, and a lot more work needs to be put in there as well. And we need to close the gap between what our corporate PPAs are willing to pay for wind and the actual cost. So looking at maybe having some kind of revenue stacking to allow for that certainty for wind farm developers. Then on the policy side as well, through grid connection and through the processing of grid connection, making that more as efficient as possible. Also making the planning application as efficient as possible. Then I think the other big issue with reaching that target really is the community acceptance aspect of wind. Like we don't need to lie to each other. Wind has a bad reputation. There's no point in ignoring it. Community engagement is essential, and it should be done well, and it should be done genuinely. My colleague Justin spoke earlier about the work that we're doing in IWEA to try and create the handbook for community engagement so that there's consistency across the industry. And we shouldn't just ignore that aspect of it. We should, we're also passionate about wind energy. We think turbines are great, and I know that most of us would say we enjoy looking at them, but we can't just dismiss that these communities are impacted by it, and we can't dismiss that they genuinely feel stress and anxiety. So if, as John talks about this early engagement that EirGrid is going into now, if we can do things like that, and if we can have genuine, transparent discussion with communities, I would hope that community engagement can help that issue. And there was a study that David alluded to earlier during the session about community engagement. It was carried out by NUIG, and they polled 250 people that lived within 4 kilometres of a wind farm. And out of those people, 75% of people said that they would keep the wind farm if community engagement was done correctly. It's not 100%, but 75% is pretty good.
It's quite strong, yes. And we'll raise to that. I'm just looking at the slide of questions here, and I think this is a big ongoing issue in terms of why it's so hard to get broad political support for renewable energy in Ireland. And we saw this week just a minor increase in carbon tax, which sounds a lot bigger, a €5 increase or even €10 increase, but in reality the ESRI has shown it have a minor effect on price. As the lone politician on the bench, Seán, why do you think that is the case?
Well, I'd have preferred to have more of a carbon tax personally. I think the reason is because we are in a minority government, and essentially nobody can put their head above the parapet too much, or they won't get whatever they want to get through. But at the same time, now we have the opportunity with the 2030 targets in Europe to say 2 things. Number one, we have no choice but to actually have more renewables. And number 2, we want them because they're good. I just saw the debate on wind. It actually made me sick to see the way wind was portrayed as worse than fossil fuels or nuclear in people's eyes. And we didn't do enough to prevent that, to sell the message that's actually good for you. So I think there are opportunities in the renewable energy proposal as well for communities to have their own renewable. And if you got a few communities selling the message, you'd have other communities saying, we want wind as well, we want our own renewables. And I think we can do a lot collectively to do that.
Very good. A question for you, John, was not directed at you, but I'm going to direct it at you. Does the grid have capacity to cater for the significant offshore wind farms that are anticipated in the Irish Sea? If not, when will it?
So most of our demand is on the East Coast. So one of the big challenges we've had is to bring our strongest onshore renewable resources on the West Coast. So one of the great challenges we have was to evacuate the power to the load centres. We'd love to have some data centres in this part of the world. We have one, unfortunately. It didn't pan out. If you put it in the right place, you have capacity. So there are areas on the East Coast where there are strong nodes which can receive it. I think the trick is to do it in a way that's coordinated and not have a developer-led free-for-all. I think we've seen that in the UK on the East Coast, where it's very much developer-led. I think you can connect an amount. You can probably do more and facilitate greater renewable penetration in the future if you do it in a clever way, which means having it joined up, so putting the nodes in the right way, and maybe even to obviate the need for onshore transmission infrastructure by having offshore infrastructure. Like the M50 around Dublin stops on the north side and finishes on the south side, but there's no continuation of that loop, so all the traffic has to go onshore. Now, I'm not advocating any kind of a traffic tunnel in the east coast of Ireland, but in electricity terms, you can actually do things in a way that reinforces the network and helps do it. So it's about clever, joined-up thinking and doing it in a way. I think that to say that offshore is 5 years away, well, it is if we let it be 5 years away. So I think it's back to the challenge is back to the policymakers and all of us, not just the policymakers, is to make this happen and make this transition to a low carbon energy future possible. And I think it's not going to be any one solution. It's not batteries, it's not interconnectors, it's not onshore wind, it's not offshore wind, but we do need it all. I think there's room for everyone in this particular solution.
Great. I'm very conscious of the time, so I'm going to ask one big question and one small question. The big question I'm going to throw at you, Peter. What is the biggest challenge for Ireland reaching a high renewable energy target in 2030? Technical, economic, social acceptance? Which?
Well, I guess we said we can do it, so what's the remaining biggest challenge? I think it's changing that mindset from this being a burden to being actually what we should do this just for the good of our pockets. You know, I think that message just isn't. It's new. It's only something that we can say recently. It's not something we could have said 5 years ago. And I think that it cuts across the economic points. But I think that's ultimately where I think the political support will begin to come from. If people believe that this is the right answer in their pockets, then I think that'll drive everything else.
Or even their children.
Or even their children.
Yes.
But we're a long way from that at the moment. At the moment it seems a burden. And
excellent answer. Very good answer and very brief. Thank you. Martin, I hope this is not an unfair question, but when are we going to see the first auction for RES? A lot of people in this room want to know. And when are you going to apply to Europe for state aid clearance?
Well, I know kind of the people that are working on it are very anxious to apply for state aid clearance as soon as they can on it. I think the RES is very much in final design stage at this point in time. We're anxious particularly that the very first part of RES, as we have signalled to the market, would be aimed at those projects that are more or less shovel ready and ready to go. So we're very anxious to see these develop as quickly as we can.
Very good, thank you. And just one final question, if I may. The NECP consultation process, when will that be announced in the coming days, or does today's events put it back a little, or can you say?
It doesn't actually put it back. Basically, the timeline in respect of NECP is really set at European requirement level. So I suppose we always have to fit in with that anyway. Basically, we see a kind of a three-phase consultation process on the NECP, the first of which we literally started this week. A very general initial introduction we put up on our website, which sets out the template for the NECP and a number of open questions. We were requested to take this approach by a number of players in the environmental network on the basis that they would like to see open questions rather than a first draft coming out. We then see the draft NECP itself, the one that will be submitted to Europe in December 2018, being the first detailed draft that will be put out. That will be the draft that will again go to full public consultation here domestically, and that will be the draft that will be used for the iterative process with the Commission. Following both of those processes, we'll do a further draft again mid-year next year.
Okay, thank you for that. Can I thank the panel very much, and I'm sorry it was a little bit tunneled because of time constraints. I am very conscious, I know everyone's conscious of the weather, and it looks lovely out there, but I know the storm is coming If you look at the Irish Times website, they're very engaged, so it must be happening. So thank you to the organisers, and thank you for a very stimulating day. And I'd now like to call on Pat Brett to just have a few closing words. Thank you.
Good night.